Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to CPAC. Woo! I'm Andrew Cooper. I'm the president of Liberty Works, one of your co-hosts here at CPAC, and I'd like to introduce you to Charlie Giroux, who is the vice chairman of our partners in America and the owners of CPAC, the American Conservative Union. So welcome, Charlie.
So great to be here in Australia, Andrew. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you.
Charlie, I believe your chairman is on his way.
He is en route.
Yeah, it's a
he would have
match
gotten here faster if he could have.
Yeah. So why don't you tell Australians a little bit, for those that aren't familiar with CPAC, why don't you tell them about CPAC and in DC?
Well, very quickly, let me first say how delighted I am to be here with all of you at the first CPAC south of the equator. That's a great honor. And I certainly look forward to be back next year with all of you in an even larger venue with even more conservatives from here down under. You know, we may be thousands of miles apart, Andrew, but we share something very, very important in common, and that is a dedication to the cause of conservatism, to limited government, to free people and free markets, and the greatest quality of life that the human world has ever known as a result of those principles. And so I'm just really delighted to be with all of you. And to answer your question directly, I will tell you a little bit about our CPAC. The American Conservative Union was founded over half a century ago. In the wake of the Goldwater election of 1964, a band of dedicated conservatives led by William F. Buckley, whom I'm sure you've all read, joined together to form what has become the largest and oldest conservative organization in the United States. And through that more than 50 years, they have always been in the vanguard of the conservative movement. And one of the flagship enterprises from the first days of ACU was CPAC, which began, quite frankly, in a room not much bigger than this, with a crowd not much larger than yours, and has grown to be 10,000 or more people gathering every year in Washington, D.C. for a 3-day conference, the most remarkable part of which is that the average age is under 30 years. It is a youth-driven, and we've been delighted to welcome some of your fellow travelers. We'd love to have all of you. The United States is, almost you, so come see us.
Yeah, no, that's tremendous. I've been to CPAC, and the buzz in that auditorium and around is just incredible. And when Trump's in town, and the security, and it's just a major event, and it's amazing. And I hope in 20 years' time, all of us here will be able to tell our children or our grandchildren that we were here at the first CPAC in Australia, and we'll be proud of it.
Absolutely, and I will say this, we are blessed that CPAC, let me just back up for a minute. If any entity or organization or conference gets the President of the United States to attend, it's a really big deal. We get the President of the United States, the Vice President of the United States, virtually every member of the cabinet, members of Congress, both senators and representatives, and leaders in business, and most important, of the conservative movement. So it has become not only a major organizational effort, but it is the largest political gathering in the United States outside of the 2 major party conventions, and they only get together once every 4 years. So I hope that you will get together every year, as we do, and watch your enterprise grow.
Yeah, no, we will, and we'll be getting together with you, right?
Look forward to that.
Here each year. It's fantastic. Now, you've been in Australia for a day or so, is that right? Have you been out to the zoo? Have you?
I haven't had a chance to see much but the inside of my hotel room, but I'm really, really looking forward to seeing your beautiful country.
So you're aware that Australia has some very interesting fauna and wildlife, and if you get a chance, hold a koala.
I want to make sure I do. I understand they're very friendly little creatures.
Pat a kangaroo.
Wouldn't take off a finger or anything.
Yeah. Most of our creatures here in Australia are friendly. We've got a very rare creature, though, in Australia. In fact, shares some heritage with American. It's so rare that it has part American and part Australian heritage. You may not have heard of it. It's called the Keneally.
I can't improve on that. We have
So-
a few strange animals in the U.S. too. Some of them are in Congress. You've heard of 4 at least, I know, right?
Yeah. It's hard to describe the Keneally. It's, honestly, I feel every year it feels like it's dying out, but it keeps coming back. It's not an entirely popular animal. It yaps a lot, right? Yaps. You know, you get a little poodle and it sort of yaps a lot, but doesn't achieve much. And that's the Keneally. Just beware, though.
Yeah, the yapping only lasts so long, and getting things done is more important. So you just keep getting things done. Staying ahead is always the best strategy.
Yeah, that's right. All right, well, that brings us really to a close, I think, for us. I mean, I just want to, once again, on behalf of the delegates and all of us here in Australia, just to thank the American Conservative Union, thank you and your chairman and Dan Schneider and all the others that have travelled down here to help us make this great.
Yes.
And next year we'll make it great again. Thank you,
Ed.
Charlie.
It's been great to be with you. Thank all of you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. We'll have our next guest on in a moment. So our next guest is Rowan Dean. Rowan Dean. So Rowan Dean, of course, is a great conservative warrior. He's the editor of Spectator Australia and also a very, very popular Sky News host. Rowan's going to join us now, and he's going to introduce a couple of other guests that he'll hold with him as well. So make Rowan Dean welcome.
My name is Rowan Dean. I'm the editor of the Spectator Australia and a Sky News host and host of Outsiders. Thank you so much for coming along. This wouldn't have been probably as packed a couple of years ago, but in the last couple of years, the rise of conservatism has been really noticeable in this country, and it's probably, as you'll discover over the next 2 days, as much because of the effectiveness of the left in marching through all our institutions, and you're going to hear that phrase again and again and again. But sane, common sense, everyday, normal people, decent people have kind of had enough of it and said, no, and are looking for alternatives. You're going to hear a lot of those today, and you're going to hear some terrific speakers, many of whom we've had on Sky, on Outsiders and other shows. Last night we had Mark Meadows, which was fantastic, on Credlin. Tonight we'll be having Raheem Kassem, and on Sunday, we will be having Nigel Farage. I just wanted to show you briefly the cover of The Spectator this week, if it comes up. There we go. Last night, you had the disgraceful passing of the abortion bill through the lower house. This is The Spectator's response to it. Daughter slaughter, and the little baby is saying to the 3 abortionists, "Stop, I identify as male." And what has happened is, if this law goes through, as has been discussed by David Van Gent and Dr. Mark Hobart, who actually had this experience in Victoria, apparently you will have the right to get an abortion based on sex selection, or that is the fear, and that is what has happened in Victoria. That's the state Australia is in, and that is why we have the rise of conservatism. But without any further ado, let me introduce to you 2 of the great conservative minds in Australia, the one and only, the great Mark Latham and Ross Cameron. You sit in the middle. If we do have a Donald Trump in Australia, it's divided between these 2. There they are. Mark Latham.
Well, it's great to be here, Rowan. What a magnificent audience of deplorables. I'm feeling right at home, and I, of course, acknowledge our conference sponsors, the Keneally Albanese Advertising Agency, who've done such a fantastic job, and I hope everyone's really braced for what's about to pass through the atmosphere. Scary ideas, people talking, people putting out points of view, opinions, debate, ideas. I mean, it's a very scary concept for the left. That's why they try to close it down and pretend that nobody here's got the capacity to make their own judgment. The only font of wisdom and intelligence in our country is between the two ears of Christina Keneally. She said that you can't be here listening to people on the program. Of course, I've come from the New South Wales Parliament, where for many years Christina sat there listening to Eddie Obeid, who now, of course, is wearing Her Majesty's pyjamas. And as an apology for this conference, he can't attend because his own liberties have been denied for very valid reasons. But Christina, having listened to Eddie, now wants to lecture us on who we should listen to. And of course, the proposition is ridiculous. And she's part of a growing worldwide trend, actually, of hectoring, patronising, condescending leftist feminists who believe that only they can run our lives. In the United States, our friends there have AOC plus 3. We have our own squad in Australia, Keneally, Plibersek, Wong and Terry Butler. And none of these people can run their own lives, let alone ours. So we reject their propositions entirely. But the thing that's important here, you mentioned Donald Trump. I think a conference like this, we are united in style and substance by the great Donald, the President of the United States. And, you know, this new mental illness that's spreading the globe, Trump derangement syndrome, is a very peculiar beast because they don't learn and apparently there's no healing power or antidote to the mental illness they're suffering, because to listen to the leftists, whether it's CNN or our own media here, the proposition is that Donald Trump is a dreadful failure in life, his whole existence has been abysmal, the guy is an outright loser, and it just makes you wonder what planet they're living on, because there's Donald Trump, who made a fortune on the toughest property market in the world, New York. He ran a top-rating TV program. He ran to be the president and cleaned up the Bush dynasty, knocked off low-energy Jeb and others to become the Republican nominee for the most powerful office in the world, and then he defeats the power of the Clinton machine. He becomes president. He becomes president, a growth economy, border protection agenda, a global peacemaker, success after success, and he's married to Miss World. What have you got to do to be regarded as successful? What have you got to do? What does it take? Compare and contrast to his chief critic in Australia, our chief critic, Senator Keneally, ran to be elected for the first time as Premier in 2011, got the Labor vote down to 24% of the vote, lost 32 seats, ran for the Bennelong by-election, they didn't want her there. Labor looked a shoe-in at the last federal election in May until the fatal moment when they put a microphone and a camera in front of Keneally and it all turned to crap. So here's someone, everything she touches in politics turns to crap. The great Donald Trump, everything he touches in life turns to gold. Yet Trump's got the problem and she hasn't. Hello, reality check. So, you know, these people are on a different planet, and of course we love their criticism because it shows we're on the right planet. So thanks everyone for having us here today.
It's interesting, Mark, that your advertising agency, I've ripped the idea off for my Financial Review column tomorrow, but I noticed that the name of the advertising agency, Wong, Albanese, Keneally, they always shorten them W-A-N-K. It works really well. Speaking of being on another planet, Ross Cameron.
Well, I do feel a slight state of shock because I assumed that if Rowan was hosting this event, I would have nothing to say all day. You know? I'd be desperately trying to squeeze in a word between the interruptions. But thank you, brother. Thank you.
Ross, you and I keep the unfair dismissal lawyers in work.
Yes, that's right. Well, somebody's got to do it. There obviously aren't enough subsidies to the legal profession in Australia today, such as the Human Rights Commission. But no, I suppose, excuse me, if we ask what is it that unites us here? We should say congratulations to Andrew Cooper for that bit of entrepreneurial genius reaching out. I don't know exactly how it happened or what the eureka moment was, but obviously CPAC, in the world of reasoning thought, in the public space, CPAC is the bluest of blue chip stocks. And certainly as just one ordinary Australian, I'm absolutely delighted to be able to be part of this. Christina Keneally is, asking Scott Morrison, I think Senator Amanda Stoker, who I understand is next cab off the rank. Christina was saying to Scott, how can you allow Amanda Stoker to attend this event? And I just say I feel absolutely honoured to be associated with CPAC. So thanks for coming to our American friends. Look, the only thing I say, the thing that unites us, I reckon, is whether we are somewhere on the spectrum of conservative to libertarian. We know that CPAC was absolutely seminal in blowing wind into the sails of Ronald Reagan. And Ronald Reagan, the 80s, along with Margaret Thatcher, Pope John Paul II, we each still had a pope who believed in God in those days. But they came together because they actually were not yet ready to give up on their culture, on their civilization. And to me, this is sort of the question we're trying to answer. Do we actually still believe in Western civilization? Do we still believe in the idea of freedom of speech, of freedom of conscience? And the last thing I'll say is that there is an argument, lots of argument about what are the difference between the Neanderthal and the Homo sapien. And I'm very pro-Neanderthal. I think the Neanderthal has been badly misrepresented. But nonetheless, there is this argument that because of the flat shape of the head of the Neanderthal, there was actually in the physiognomy of the organism a smaller voice box, which meant that the Neanderthal did not develop articulated speech. And that fully articulated speech is the unique inheritance of the Homo sapien. And then in our culture, from the time of Homer, 800 BC, our ancestors, our tribe, developed the alphabet. And we had gone from pictographic writing systems to syllabic to alphabetic. And this alphabetic writing system, which gave access to knowledge, pushed it out from the elites at the centre and made knowledge accessible to ordinary people. That's really what we are about. And we celebrate the idea that the one special gift we have is articulate speech. But the whole leaders of the progressive left say we must suppress and bury that capability we have to hold a different opinion. It's the dumbest idea I've ever heard in my life, and I'm just glad CPAC is here celebrating freedom of opinion.
Now, always buried within a Ross Cameron speech is a little lie, and the little lie in there was the last thing I'm going to say, because it never is with Ross, it never is. Mark Latham, you were leader of the Labor Party. You're now leader of One Nation in New South Wales. Much has been made of the fact that supposedly you did this massive swing from over here on the left all the way to over here on the right, but you've always argued that it's the rest of them that moved and you've stayed as a fixed point. I would agree with that, absolutely. To what extent has the rise of conservatism been due to people like yourself, hard-working men, working class men and women, believe in a hard day's work, believe in a solid education and getting on, and they no longer see that in the left? How much has that led to the rise of conservatism?
Well, I think it's fundamental in that I joined the Labor Party in a public housing estate branch in 1979, and if you'd stood up in that gathering and said, actually what we believe in here is two fundamental propositions. The first is instead of judging people on merit, a poor person as someone without resources, wealth and income in life. What we're actually going to do is judge them on their race, gender and sexuality, how they look. You would have been dismissed as a primitive. That the whole idea, you know, the great statement of Martin Luther King was to judge people by their character, their work ethic, their contribution to community, not just to look at them and think, oh, there's a skin colour that defines their whole life, a gender that defines their existence, a sexuality that tells me everything I need to know about that person. So the Labor ideal was to judge each individual on their merit, and if they had disadvantages in life according to socio-economic circumstance, income and wealth in particular, try and do something in a reasonable, responsible way to help them. So that's the first proposition that would have been endorsed by that branch, and the whole rise of identity politics would have been seen as a complete betrayal of the principles, the Whitlamite principles of meritocracy. So we're united here, not just for people who might be thought of as conservatives or libertarians or nationalists, but traditional social democrats who believe in merit and judging the individual on their inherent worth. And the second proposition that would have been laughed out of court in that working class branch out in the western suburbs of Sydney in the 70s was that according to an environmental theory and an environmental ideal that people had, what you need to do is march into an area like the Hunter Valley and close down the industry that puts food on the table, supposedly because the planet is going to end tomorrow. So, you know, the whole idea that you would be marching to the Hunter Valley where, for instance, in the Singleton and Muswellbrook local government areas, 60% of the economic wealth and output is based on coal, and you would close that down with no job replacement strategy and throw working people on the welfare scrap heap with all the social consequences that come from that, that too would have been just regarded as unbelievable from a different world. And that's now the world that the leftists inhabit. And the most refreshing aspect of the last federal election was whether it was in the Hunter Valley or central Queensland with the Adani debate, that the people there, the working communities, they weren't going to be turkeys voting for Christmas. They weren't going to sign up. They weren't going to sign the economic suicide note. They were going to put jobs ahead of the environmental theory. So, you know, this is a refreshing enlightenment. You know, the Keneally's and all that, it's, oh, the people out there are so stupid, they don't know what's going on. Well, they did know what was going on. And they knew not to vote for Keneally, in short, and the people who wanted to throw them on the welfare scrap heap. So that enlightenment was so refreshing in the last election, which, again, coming back to that Labor branch in the 70s, people would have said, yeah, well, everyone here is getting better education in their families, so we want our kids to get through to university. All that's happened. So the paradox of today's left is the more advanced, the more educated, the better informed our society, the more primitive they want us to be. And, you know, Ross made the point about free speech. It's true in their thinking as well on those two mutant leftist concepts of identity politics and throwing working people on the welfare scrap heap.
Ross, Mark, you and I basically were talking about Donald Trump long before anybody else was. Why did you really see that Donald Trump would succeed? What was it about him that you saw would overcome the whole Clinton machine? You were adamant about it. Why?
It was a combination of elements. I had read The Art of the Deal in my, I think it was my late teens, and it had quite a big impact on me. And so I started with a positive bias towards Trump. Then I took a business trip to the States in right at the end of 2015. So it was a year before the nomination, and we went to New York, LA, San Francisco. And over the course of the trip, we took about 40 Uber journeys. And in each case, I interviewed the driver.
Bet the driver enjoyed that.
Yeah.
Did the driver get a word in anyway?
I always assume an interaction with me is going to be the highlight of the other person's day.
Absolutely.
I think you've got to start believing in yourself, don't you? And anyway, out of these Uber drivers, whom I regard as sort of like the canary in the coal mine, I noticed two things. That about 30 out of 40 Uber drivers said, I'm with Trump. But the second thing I noticed, as a former political candidate myself, is I noticed they loved him. It wasn't just that they were being dragged to the barrier, it was like they could not wait to get into the ballot box. And we started seeing this. We talk about the rallies. I think you can tell a successful politician, whatever the combination of ingredients is, tends to draw. There is a kind of energy. It's a bit hard to describe. I think it's ancient. It was like Napoleon when he came out of exile in Alba and marched towards Paris, and the army just rose up around him. And really, I see Donald Trump is a special dude. You know, the thing does not work without Donald. The fact to have the guts to stand up in front of the whole establishment. And, you know, I mean, I absolutely love your employer, News Corporation, and Fox News. But, you know, in a presidential debate, for a candidate to look at Rupert Murdoch and say, you need me more than I need you. Like, I think I got a big ego, right? He stood outside. And so for the first, everybody else was kind of in on the deal. And I think it was the other thing I will say to you is I felt, the last thing I will say to you, in terms of the quality of the ideas, even among the Republicans, there was a qualitative difference in the ideas. And build the wall. I mean, the truth is civilization has been built. I see, have we got any Fairfax media journalists here today? Okay. We got one up the back. What is that, Nick O'Malley up there at the back? Everybody give Nick O'Malley a big round of applause.
Stay focused, stick to the point, Ross.
Nick is kind of...
I'm just doing my job. Stick to the point, follow the
Nick
train
has
of
been
thought.
given permission for day release from the Gulag to come out. There's another idea out there. But the point is that Trump, you know, I would say ever since the division of the first eukaryotic cell, which had a cell wall, you know, the first key ever discovered in Mesopotamia in the treasury of a little temple. Now we see Fairfax Media, to survive, needs a pay wall, okay? I wish you didn't, but apparently you do. So Fairfax Media needs a paywall, but the United States of America can't have one. Donald Trump was the only one with the guts to say, what are we actually doing in Syria? You know, we've gone into business with a grab bag of the most hardcore terrorists in the world. What are we doing? What is the objective? With everybody else, the machine just rolled on. But Trump had the humility to ask the simple questions which were in the interests of the citizen rather than of the state. And that combination, I just felt, obviously, he's our guy.
Fantastic. He landed it. He landed it. He landed bang on. Beautiful.
Could I
Mark.
just say I always travel with taxi drivers more than Uber drivers.
Every now and again, a taxi driver will just whack me. And I say, what's that for? They say, well, you're Mark Latham, aren't you?
Well, I have the advantage they all call me sir. Yeah. And are very keen to open and close the door for me. So, but my experience is not in transit with Trump. It would have been during the Republican nomination process and those great primary debates where Trump would stand in the middle and define himself by the wall, and they'd all disagree and he'd win. So I was watching that. It must have been after being sacked somewhere in the media. I can't remember too many of that. But I had a bit of time in my hands, whatever the outrage was, or whatever the thing was. Anyway, I was transfixed by someone who I thought was speaking his mind. He had nothing to lose. What was the worst thing that happened to Donald Trump if he didn't get the presidency? He goes back to his wonderful life. So he was fearless, which is a defining characteristic in these times. He was fearless and had nothing to lose. And I thought he was sort of half Australian because he believed in talking about observable truth. Call a spade and whack you over the head with it. And he also had a great sense of humour, you know, a larrikin quality. So I thought, this guy's half Aussie, we've got to be backing the Donald in this contest. But, you know, Ross, we've got to admit, through the process, it wasn't always easy. And perhaps the toughest moment was at the time of the Access Hollywood tapes being released, subsequently described as locker room talk, and I think that's probably a fair description of it. And this happened on a Saturday Australian time, and I'm thinking, well, I'm out there with Ross and Rowan, basically only three of us in Australia, defending Trump and saying that he's the man. How do we handle this set of tapes that's come forward with the locker room talk? You know, this is a tough one. How do we defend the Donald when it all looks a wee bit indefensible? And I thought, maybe I'm a bit fortunate here. It's Saturday. I haven't got a media interview until Tuesday. Maybe it'll all sort of wash over and I won't have to say anything about it. But then I tuned into Sky News before the era of unfair dismissal when Ross was there, I think on a Sunday night, and I thought this will be interesting. Ross is going to be asked about Access Hollywood. How does he defend it? And this exposed, once and for all, the true genius of Ross Cameron. Because when asked about the locker room talk, he said, well, this just proves one thing beyond doubt, that in the universe of Donald Trump, this demonstrates the centrality of the woman. The centrality of the woman and the female form, and all women in the United States can be rest assured if Trump becomes president, he's thinking of them all the time. So I thought, you know, I'm mere John the Baptist in this. The true Messiah has arrived in terms of defending Trump, and that was just truly magnificent.
Thank you. Bless you, brother.
Gather your thoughts around the central role of the woman, Ross Cameron.
Yes, well, you know, there is absolutely no doubt that she is the celestial body around which the male orbits.
It was Trump's worst moment, and we're going to really sort of dwell on it.
But I do say that there was a journalist at The Atlantic, whose name just escapes me, somebody else may remember, who characterised Trump and the Trump phenomena and as she said the mainstream establishment media took Trump literally but not seriously. Say it again? Selena Cito. But the American people took Trump seriously but not literally. And, you know, this is my problem. If I'm going to have a crack at Nick O'Malley sitting up the back of the room there...
You've already done that.
Sorry. You know, we had this complete phalanx of monoculture. From one end of the ABC to the far end of, you know, Fairfax Media, there was just this completely monolithic view that Donald Trump could not be taken seriously. And the next step, the real, in my judgment, betrayal of the audience was that the people who took Donald Trump seriously could not be countenanced. And Hillary Clinton's classic expression of basket of deplorables sort of summarised a very broad spectrum establishment view about Trump and his supporters. And one of the problems is it has a range of consequences when we get this analysis so completely wrong. I mean, we had 29 out of 30 professional academics at the US Confusion Centre at Sydney University who got up every morning and said, how much more deeply can I bury Donald Trump under this assault where, a bit like Keneally, I mean, Christina is saying, well, this man is not a decent person. And this is this classic Saul Alinsky strategy that if you can damage the individual, if you can damage the man's character, if you can make him someone who you should not be associated with on a personal level, you can define the whole conversation. And I just think the consequence of this catastrophic misjudgment was that the whole of the Australian foreign policy establishment and the whole of the Australian government, and you know, yesterday we were at Mark Latham's chamber, the Legislative Council of New South Wales passed a unanimous motion in the lead up to the election saying Donald Trump is a slug who is unfit for public office. Yeah, that's an Australian Parliament talking about a prospective leader of the Western world. And then you have, Malcolm Turnbull goes to Washington doesn't even bother to pick up the phone. I mean, it was like multiple other he was all over Barry Obama. He was all over John Kerry. He was all over. Who's the little guy again?
Little Marco.
Little Marco. A good guy. I'm pro Marco, but we could not. We could not bring ourselves to ring up Donald Trump and say, "Have you got time for a cup of coffee?" And so then, when Trump has the conversation with Malcolm Turnbull, when he's ringing all the 100 world leaders, he gets off the phone after speaking to the Australian Prime Minister and says, "That was the worst call yet." Okay, so that's where we start as a nation, because the whole of the media sold out. The whole of the media, the elite, wished to say, we are too good for Donald Trump and for his supporters. We are in some elite priesthood of opinion, and they are all waifeth. They're all a bunch of waifeth. Yeah, look, that's a rambling general.
That's good.
But it's also worth remembering that it's also worth remembering that the leftists are discredited not just in their faulty election predictions, the famous Barry Cassidy tweet that the nightmare is over, Hillary's been elected on election day, but in their predictions as to what a Trump presidency would mean, because their ultimate prediction was that by now the world would have ended in nuclear holocaust, that he was going to launch World War III. And, of course, you can rely on the fact they're 180 degrees wrong. The opposite has happened, that in the Middle East and elsewhere, in North Korea, Trump has tried to be an influence for peace and stability. And, they made no attempt to understand what he was on about, because as someone believing in observable truth, Trump had noted the invasion of Iraq was a wholesale disaster. It spawned ISIS and made the world a less safe place. And, of course, foreign occupation in the Middle East just makes whoever you're fighting fight harder as they try to expel the invading forces with the emotion of nationalism. So Trump knew that and is not going to be launching foreign policy adventurism and land wars that have stained American foreign policy like Vietnam and Iraq. So he was never going to be a warmonger. In fact, the opposite was going to be true. You only had to listen to his views about Iraq and his condemnation of Bush II to know the reality. So, all these things weren't just wrong, they were wrong through ignorance, an unwillingness to actually listen to what was being said.
Now, you speak about kind of tensions and things in the past. Ross, we had Mike Pompeo in Australia last weekend. We see tensions rising with Donald Trump trade-wise with China. What are your thoughts on that and the reaction of, say, Marise Payne and Scott Morrison to, well, two things. One, agreeing probably to put boats into the Strait of Hormuz to help escort tankers, but also their response to Mike Pompeo's warnings about China. I know you disagree with that. Tell us your thoughts.
Well, look, I appreciate you asking the question, Rowan, because probably on this one, I may well be in a minority in this room. I mean, we've got the Epoch Times out there, and I'm naturally, like I suspect all of us here, we see what's happening in Hong Kong, and we see the citizens of Hong Kong sort of saying, well, look, we just want to enjoy the same sort of freedoms that others do. But yeah, I am in dissent. Okay, I would say to you, I don't think this is an issue in which I really put it to you with deep conviction. I could be wrong. But yeah, I think that we know from looking at the history of civilizations that they rise and fall. That, Ariel Durant says that no great civilization was ever defeated from outside until it destroyed itself from within. And when you look at what we're seeing is the re-emergence of a civilization, 1.4 billion people, about a sixth of the world's population. The problem I would say to Mike, if we put the principle aside for 1 second and just look at the bottom line, you've essentially got Australia, which is the economy which is most deeply enmeshed in the story of the growth of the Chinese middle class. The Chinese who are providing basically more foreign investment than anyone else, certainly more foreign students than anyone else, certainly more tourists, 1 million a year, than anybody else. And we're going to say to these people, 1 ship out of 4 leaving an Australian port goes straight to China, 1 out of 4. And at this stage of the game, we're going to turn around and say, we don't trust the Chinese. Well, I kind of say to Mike, mate, I wish you could have told us 50 years ago, right? Because now Australia is the bunny who's going to feel the pain most acutely. But put that to one side, okay? Put the commercial question to one side. And I simply recognise there's a bunch of Australian small businesses out there who are trying to connect with foreign markets, wanting to participate in the Chinese story, and our whole leadership is constantly beating the drum, making it harder and harder. I just say to you, okay, so they've lifted 800 million people out of poverty since Deng Xiaoping. According to all the best data, about the average Chinese about 5% smarter than the average white guy. Every Chinese kid, okay, well, they love Mandarin and love their own syllabic script. They're all learning ours. In the state of New South Wales, of 8 million people, there's 130 non-Chinese sitting Mandarin for the high school certificate. Tiny little fragment. They're filling stadiums with kids learning English. The average Shanghai 17-year-old is 2.5 years ahead of the average Sydney 17-year-old in literacy, numeracy and problem solving.
Unless they're Chinese.
That's right, unless they're Chinese. And so I say to you, and all you have to do is if you walk into a Sydney selective school, Sydney Boys High, North Sydney boys or girls, you feel like you're walking into a suburb of Shanghai or Hong Kong, right? Because they want it. They have ambition. Marcus Aurelius. He said, the value of a man is no greater than the sum of his ambitions. Okay, and I'm saying to you, this is a civilization on the rise. And I just believe that there is, if my criticism of the American response, I don't actually believe it's Donald Trump's response. I'm happy to trust Donald on the trade dispute, okay, but on the wider strategic question of do we get a benefit from seeking to hold the head of China under the water for longer to resist this inevitable rise, or do we, as the great Scottish philosopher David Hume, 1750s, who wrote a text called The Jealousies of Trade, he was the guy who really had this first insight of the moral power of free trade between nations and what he called self-correcting markets. He was the original Austrian laissez-faire guy, or the original modern one. There were ancient ones, like Xenophon. But the point I want to make is at a time where there was this bitter rivalry between France and England, David Hume came out and he said, I pray for the flourishing of the economy of Germany, Spain, Italy, and even France itself. And he said, I'm satisfied that the greatest possible benefit will flow to all of their peoples and to the people of Britain if our leaders will adopt such benevolent sentiments towards our rivals. And I just say to you, I don't believe China is the world's biggest problem today. I don't believe Russia. You know, when I look at our Americans here today and I think, you know, you guys have just wasted 2 years on a complete spectre, on a total bogey of Russia because Hillary Clinton needed a feather to cover her modesty with for how she lost the election. So you've got the leadership of the free world is bouncing at shadows. You know, you're going to give us, United States of America is going to give us global leadership with what? James Comey, Peter Strzok, Andy McCabe, Valerie Jarrett. I'm sorry, you got 80% of the Chinese communist leadership are engineers. You got Maurice Payne, Australia's Minister for Foreign Affairs, walking around the Pacific lecturing them about gender balance on boards, while the Chinese leadership is rocking in saying, can I build you a bridge over the mountains of Papua New Guinea? And then we wonder why we're falling further and further behind. And so look, I just say on China, there is, when you're under assault, when you're under challenge from a new competitor, a new rival, there is this impulse always to underestimate your own flaws and defects and to exaggerate the flaws of your adversary. And mate, if you can point to any example of human history of lifting basically 1 billion people out of poverty in 2 generations, give me another one, I'm ready to hear it. Then I say to you, when I got sacked because I made the observation about Disneyland. This is a group of people who wants to participate in our story. There are other groups in the world today who do not wish to participate in our story. They wish explicitly to destroy it. So I say, why don't we seek to make friends with those who want to participate? I would recommend a grand global compact between the West, Russia, China. Let's explore space together. Let us solve the health problems together. Let us, I'm just not convinced. To me, it feels like these sort of intelligence agencies are running American foreign policy, and indeed Australian, rather than the citizens.
There you go, Ross Cameron. Mark, I'm just going to change the topic briefly, unless you want to comment on China, but you have a colleague of yours in the New South Wales Parliament who believes that men have uteruses. Can you please explain to us how she arrived, is it a she? I don't know anymore, arrived at this particular conclusion?
Yeah, we haven't checked her identification today.
Right.
Jenny Leong is the Greens member for Newtown and is perhaps the most unhinged person in Australian public life, because on one hand, the climate debate, she'll say respect the science, respect the science, respect the science. But when it comes to biological science, she's arguing that men can have babies because it's not just women who've got a uterus. So she wants us to respect science on climate, but not biology. So these things are quite a contradiction. But I had a forum with her recently. The BBC World came out and did a show, and it was about Australian multiculturalism. And I think it was indicative of her state of mind that I asked her to say, as a member of Parliament, someone who's obviously, privileged to serve the Australian people in New South Wales, could she say that she loves our country? And she said, no, she couldn't. She loves the suburb where she lives, but worries in particular on days like Australia Day. If you get on the train, there are people waving Australian flags, and she takes that as a sign of aggression. So, this is a different world, and love of country, a basic civilisational value is something they're trying to attack, rewriting history, challenging Australia Day, and the notion that you can be elected into this parliament, enjoy the privileges of public service, but not love the country that's done that for you. So it's a different mindset, and I suppose if you don't love Australia and you think that waving the flag's a sign of aggression, you probably would think that men can have a uterus, but none of it makes any sense.
Ross, how important is that sense of national pride in a multicultural nation? How important is it? And we do see a lot in Australia now. Mark referred to Australia Day, the attacks on Australia Day. People graffitiing statues. There's a relentless attack on our history and our institutions. How important is it to push back against that, do you think?
I'm absolutely loving Rowan having to ask me all these questions. Well, look, this, of course, is the meta-narrative of the progressive left is, at the heart of it at the moment, is waifism. You old bunch of waifists. And what the left is seeking to do, okay, the history of our civilization is based on the idea of Mark talk about merit and of the idea that a person is innocent until they are proven to be guilty of some charge. The progressive left is absolutely invested in building up a permanent conviction of shame against every person because of the, there's like 20,000 directive genes in the double helix, and there's, 3 or 4 of them that relate to the pigmentation of your skin. And the progressive brain is just absolutely massively obsessed with pigmentation, right? If you want to talk about genetics and waifism, what we're discovering is this revolution in organic chemistry and biology, which is telling us how much we all share, of how closely related to each other we are within the human species, no matter what the external pigment looks like. But I just say, lots and lots of these issues, the average Australian male, I've said it before, if you were on a ship that sank and you got stuck in a lifeboat and you were going to be stuck with one male chosen at random from the population of any country, and you learnt that your lifeboat companion, was an Australian male, maybe a beef grazier from Toowoomba, you would say, thank God. Praise the Lord. I've got a chance. I've got some ballast in the boat. And what the reason is that none of the left's arguments actually make any sense. What they wish to do is create an atmosphere of shame across the culture so that everybody lives under a permanent conviction of offence, and that is based around the idea of privilege. Can I just tell you, I like privilege. I am pro-privilege. I want more of it. I say to you that if you look at the reason is you go to, they say, Diogenes of Sinope said that the definition of madness is to want something you can't have. I say to you that Edmund Burke answered Rowan's question more succinctly than me.
It's not unusual.
And Edmund Burke said that a person's connection with the little platoon, which is their neighbourhood, that sense, and you mentioned, what's her name? Miss Forgettable. She was attached to her own neighbourhood. And so we feel an attachment to family. I would say the first connection a child feels, is with its mother. That's where it begins. The ability to bond and connect. And then with the neighbourhood. And then from the neighbourhood to maybe state of origin. And then we go from there to our nation. And if you don't feel a sense of pride and connection with your own nation and tribe and people, I say you are defective.
Beautifully landed as always. Give him a big cheer. He always lands it beautifully.
Ross,
Mark.
there is another Fairfax journalist here who's escaped detection. I welcome your analysis. Aaron Patrick is here and taking photos. And Aaron inevitably tomorrow will write this up as a white supremacist jamboree. And perhaps Nick will even join him in that. But have you got any thoughts about Aaron Patrick, Ross?
Well, look, Aaron, I regard...
I'm hosting this, Mark. Sorry. Ross.
I couldn't resist.
Now, Mark, we've got a couple of minutes left. You're now back in politics. What's your chief goal over the next 4 years? The New South Wales Libs have been a massive disappointment, as we were talking about earlier. They seem to have caved in to God knows what leftists thinking. What's your goal over the next couple of years?
Well, fight for civilisational values, love of country, merit selection, resilience, and observable truths in public policy. These are the things that define us, that make us advanced as a nation, and they're the things that are under attack. Part of our civilisation, of course, one of the big parts of our work is the defence of religious freedom, because I'm not a religious person myself, but the truth is Christianity has been an important part of our civilisation, one of its essential pillars. So we need to bring in religious freedom laws in New South Wales, particularly in light of the Folau case, because we don't wake up every morning and think our moral code is informed by the Bible, but where do we get our sense of right and wrong? From the Ten Commandments. Christ to this day has been the world's greatest moral teacher, and his message is probably becoming more relevant, not less. So these are all important institutions. How does the left march through institutions, capture them and destroy the best things of our civilisation? Well, this is why we've got the attacks on Christianity, on merit selection, on love of country, on resilience, the emergence of a snowflake society. So, they're all things we've got to push back against and defend the best things about our country.
Ross, this is going to be very, very difficult for you, and I may have to interrupt you at some stage because we only have just over a minute left. Your thoughts on what Mark was just saying about the role of Christianity in either conservative thinking or in Western civilization or in our society.
There's a very compelling argument. Look, one of the things I love about Mark is Mark says, I'm not a Christian, I'm not a believer. There is a sense, but he says, I recognise the importance of this sort of pillar in our culture. And I don't think there's any doubt that, say, for example, the Christian doctrine of grace, love your enemies and forgive those who do you harm. The world had been completely dominated by an ethic of an eye for an eye. And indeed, when we find the Islamic terrorist in Goulburn's Supermax who bashes his roommate, what he carves into his forehead with a razor blade is eye for eye. It's still believed that this should be the way in which we relate to each other. But as David Hume said, the expanded and benevolent sentiment which finds the good in our rivals and engages with them, indeed, I would say, as the carbon molecule does, the most promiscuous element on the whole table of elements, is looking to engage, and that's the story of life. We obviously owe a massive debt to Christianity. I just say to you that, almost certainly without Christianity, provided the motive that drove literacy, which saw the founding fathers, basically every man, woman and child on the Mayflower who was old enough to read could read and write. So you had the first time in history a nation created on the basis of an idea, but it was literate from the prince to the ploughboy, and that motive came from Christianity. So whether you believe he rose from the dead or not, you can probably thank him that you can read and write.
Ladies and gentlemen, Ross Cameron and Mark Latham, give them a standing ovation. Come on. Up you go.